So, thank you so much for joining us, everyone, on this very busy Monday morning. I'm Susan Demas, the executive editor of Lincoln Square. And joining me today is Patrick Coolican. He's the editor of the Minnesota Reformer. Patrick is a former Capitol reporter for the Minneapolis Star Tribune. He's also worked for the Las Vegas Sun and the Seattle Times, among others. Welcome to our show, Patrick.
Good to be here.
So this was a historic weekend with Trump's military parade and millions turning out across the country for No Kings rallies. But a lot of us woke up on Saturday morning to the news that two Minnesota Democratic lawmakers and their spouses had been shot in what appears to be politically motivated crimes. Former State Speaker Melissa Hortman and her husband are dead, while State Senator John Hoffman and his wife are still hospitalized. And on Sunday night, police announced that they had apprehended the suspected killer. So, Patrick, I know you and your team have been covering all angles of this story all weekend. There have been reports that the suspect had a list of other lawmakers in Minnesota and other states, as well as abortion providers. What do we need to know about these assassinations?
Um, yeah, they police found a document that included this kind of hit list of people who were believed to be abortion rights advocates, including former Speaker Hortman and Hoffman, as well as abortion providers. There was also some ramblings. I don't think we should use the word manifesto in these cases,
Mm.
but especially apparently not in this case. And he was found last night with or excuse me, when they found his car, they found a number of weapons in his car, including AK-47. So yeah, the kind of arsenal. And so all weekend, while he was still on the loose, there was dozens of prominent lawmakers who were on the law enforcement had to provide security. I think some changed their locations. This was, I know of at least Wisconsin lawmakers, but certainly Minnesota were the bulk of them. He seems to have, as we've often seen in these cases, a lot of um, failures in his life. He was having financial problems, apparently. There was some early reporting that he had a security company, but then start to be in talk to his neighbor, or excuse me, his roommate and longtime friend. He said, "Yeah, that was not really it was an idea he had, but it was not really a thing." Um, and then of course he was apparently radicalized, especially in the last 5 years, and which brought him to this point. We talked to a kind of local expert in um, Christian nationalism, and she told us that the theology here is that you'll be rewarded if you
Mm.
commit violence in the name of this kind of fundamentalist ideology.
Okay. And I did read an interview on the Daily Beast with a longtime friend of his who said that he was a supporter of Donald Trump. I know has been kind of a disinformation campaign about his politics that you have written about extensively in your last column.
Yeah, on Saturday, I think there's this whole machinery on the right where every news event must be in some way distorted to be the fault of um, Democrats, and so their move was to somehow make this bizarre claim that Melissa Hortman, who was murdered, had crossed Tim Walz
Mm.
on an issue recently, and therefore Walz should be a suspect.
And
Uh,
the issue was healthcare for non documented immigrants?
Undocumented, yeah. We have passed in 2023. Melissa Hortman was the Speaker of the House. She was instrumental in passing this law that created eligibility for what we call here Minnesota Care. It's a subsidized health insurance program for the working poor. Um, both
Is that
walls.
the Obamacare expansion under Medicaid?
No, it's not Medicaid.
Okay,
It's our own. It's our own
your
unique
own.
program.
Okay.
And um, but it was obviously the Republicans' biggest issue. We have a tied House here, 67-67. They would have shut the government down
Mm,
um, if Minnesota had tried if Democratic leaders had continued the undocumented folks' ability to enroll in the program. So Hortman and Walls together came to this compromise agreement. Children are still going to be enrolled; adults will not by the end of the year. That was in exchange for a budget agreement to keep the government open. Otherwise, they would have shut it down on July 1st. They both agreed to that. Uh, Now, because she made that agreement, Hortman had to vote in favor of it. She
mhm,
was a person of her word. It was a difficult vote for her. She spoke about it tearfully. I believe it was last week, actually. And this was somehow incredibly distorted into somehow she was actually afraid and that she was some sort of a maverick um, who had voted against her party. This just was
mm,
a complete distortion of what actually was going on. And then, of course, as we learn more about Bolter, I mean, the story never made sense anyway because Hoffman also voted he voted to against the bill rolling back Minnesota Care. So it never made any sense.
mm,
Why would you shoot? They're on opposite sides of the bill, so it just
mhm,
didn't make any sense. And then, of course, the more we learn about Bolter, with he's got this list, this hit list. And it seems to be about abortion rights.
mm,
So the idea that somehow Tim Walz ought to be considered a suspect was preposterous. But as we know, that doesn't really matter to these people. What they want to do is give their soldiers
mhm,
something to something to grab onto, and it was all over the place,
right,
And these guys have often millions of followers,
mhm,
and I mean, people who they figure, well, if these guys say it, then it's true. The other
right,
distortion that they ran with was that this guy was on a workforce development board here,
mhm,
and so they were calling him Wall's appointee.
mhm,
Also ridiculous because I mean, you've covered state government, so you know this, but it's especially true in Minnesota. We have hundreds of these boards.
mhm, right,
And anybody can be on the board. All you have to do is volunteer. And so, as I said in my column, I mean, it's like someone saying that a deacon had been appointed by the bishop. I mean, it's just ridiculous.
mhm,
Um, Tim Walz had no interaction with this guy. He had no idea who he was. We currently have, I think, 300 and something vacancies for
mm,
these boards and commissions. So it's like they're desperate. And so then, the New York Post ran with Wall's
right,
appointee. I mean, it's just a total smear, and made me angry Saturday as I was far from able to process what was going on personally because I mean, I saw Melissa Hortman on Thursday. And so it made me angry, and that's what I wound up writing a column about this. It's just it's one of the most despicable things that I've ever witnessed, and of course, it continued yesterday with Senator Mike Lee, uh,
right. It
U.S.
wasn't
Senator.
just yeah, it wasn't just right-wing influencers like Laura Loomer or Mike Cernovich, a sitting US senator from Utah and others were spreading the suspect was a Marxist.
I mean, it's incredible. Um, and of course, as the truth comes out, we'll learn that he certainly was not a Marxist, but that won't matter. Um, it never does. And for a U.S. senator, it's just incredible how far we've gone down when a U.S. senator's and a different time and place he would have been censured. I
Right,
think at the very least, and he would have been humiliated off the national stage. Maybe he would have been primaried or something, but that's not the world we live in now.
right. Um, I I'm wondering as a journalist, how do you feel like you can effectively combat this level of misinformation and lies that often gets reposted millions of times, especially on X, before most stories are even posted on reputable websites? More and more people just live in information bubbles where they will never see factual reporting on this case and so many other issues. So, what do you think the solution to this is?
Well, all I can do, I mean, that's a little above my pay grade, is fixing the
Yeah,
information environment.
I'm
But
not asking you to do it alone.
all I can do is, and I tell this to my staff because we always feel so overwhelmed by a sense of powerlessness. But what I say is, it's like anything else in life. You have to do what you're obligated to do. You do
Mhm.
your duty. And so on Saturday, in my case, that meant tracking some of this and putting out a piece as quickly as I could um, to try to at least y- do my part. That's all I could do. It is one of our most read stories of the year. So that's helpful. But I mean, my own personal opinion is, I mean, as it happens, and I talked to Melissa about this on Thursday. A There was an idea there was a proposal in the Minnesota legislature blocked by Republicans who controlled half the House
Mm,
to tax social media companies.
mm,
And so anybody who collects data, we would tax them. And I think that we've got to tax and regulate these companies. Um, it might be better if they were out of existence. Not Substack, of course, but um, but I think they are creating what the economists call negative externalities. The business model of something like X and Facebook, it creates this massive information pollution,
mm,
and they ought to be forced to pay to clean it up. um, and or we just need to cram down their profits so they become far less influential and powerful.
right. As journalists, when we make a mistake, we try and correct it as quickly as possible. And, if you make a large enough mistake, there can be legal ramifications, but nothing like that exists with social media. In fact, the algorithms are usually primed to, spread disinformation more than facts. And so, it's asymmetric warfare and it's very difficult, for those of us who are trying to do good fact based reporting.
Yeah, I mean
Um,
it's impossible when you're up against people who really, I think, openly consider themselves propagandists,
right.
and as they view themselves as warriors in some kind of an informational war. Whereas I don't really see myself that way. I see myself as trying to get at the truth. And so, yeah, as you described it, it's completely asymmetrical. And they're also, I mean, I think we both worked in newsrooms, and occasionally you get someone with a personality defect in a newsroom, of course. But I think what you see is that people they must be just complete sociopaths or something to not have any shame,
Mhm.
and able to put out this kind of garbage, and then not be embarrassed. I mean, if I made these claims myself and it was wrong about them, I'd be mortified. I
Right.
mean, I would cancel my accounts and go live in a hole. I'd be so embarrassed.
Yeah.
I'm embarrassed. I still remember my worst corrections, um,
Absolutely.
and I have tried to learn from them, and that's just not what we're dealing with here.
No. No. It sounds like you knew Melissa Hortman very well, having covered her for years. I don't know if you also know Senator Hoffman. Can you tell us a little bit about who they are? Because a lot of times that gets lost in these stories.
Yeah. Hoffman was known. I knew Hoffman far less than I knew Melissa Hortman. Hoffman was known as a champion of human services. He was committee chair in that area. He had, I think, was in recovery himself from addiction. I think that was well known. And he had really great compassion for folks with disabilities and believed strongly in the responsibility of Minnesotans to take care of them. Um, he, for a long time, his best friend in the state senate was a Republican.
Mm,
They had something of a falling out um, during the very contentious and consequential 2023 legislative session when Democrats had the trifecta and they did a lot of stuff. But that's the kind of guy he was. Someone who could uh, speak across, could hold hands with folks across the aisle, shake hands. Um, Melissa Hortman, I think will go down in Minnesota history as one of the more consequential speakers we've ever had,
mm.
and one of the more consequential um, progressive leaders. Um, I honestly think I'd put her up there with someone like Paul Wellstone
Wow,
and
that's
Governor
amazing.
Walz. Yeah.
And Paul
Um,
Wellstone, of course, died in 2002. He was a U.S. Senator in Minnesota and, considered like the godfather of the modern progressive movement.
yeah, I think that's right. I think she's right in his footsteps, although in a very different way. I mean, I think he was someone who um, we think of as a inspiring leader. Um, I think that Melissa Hortman was inspiring in her own way, but as a extremely skilled legislative strategist and tactician, and also someone who, um, to me, I was inspired by her as someone who was so down to earth
Mm.
and um, never took herself seriously, despite all of her achievements.
Did you expect that she might run for U.S. Senate or governor at some point?
I asked her that, and she said, I'm pretty powerful where I am sitting.
Yeah.
And I always loved that answer too. She didn't need to be spending a year and a half going around to people's living rooms trying to get the votes of delegates for a Democratic nomination when she could be at the state capitol driving policy. I mean, that was her passion, was public policy. She kind of outsourced the political stuff,
Mm.
but she loved the getting in the weeds of policy and also the strategy and tactics of how you get big legislation passed.
Yeah.
And she's got a lot of big legislation on with her name on it.
And you said that the House was evenly divided. So what does her death mean as far as the balance of power?
Well, we're out of session.
Okay.
There was a special session to close out the budget, and that's where she had to make that very difficult vote.
Hmm.
Um, and so there'll be a special election, and it's now a safe Democratic seat. It's interesting though that it was when she came around into politics 25 years ago or so. That was you remember this from Michigan. The suburbs were Republican,
Right.
and so she lost a couple times.
Mm,
before she won, and it was a swing district. It was considered a swing district. It certainly no longer is. Um, but I always thought that was influential in how she acted as a public servant and as a legislator because she understood what it was like to win an edge seat and then to hold it.
right.
Um, and um, and I think that um, influenced how she managed her caucus and those relationships.
You have a visitor in back.
I know, I know.
I remember those days. My
Summer
kids are much
vacation.
older. Um, well, it seems to me from the outside looking in that it has been a tense few years in the Twin Cities, starting with the 2020 police killing of George Floyd. And of course, your governor, Tim Walz, has been a frequent target of Trump as he was Kamala Harris's running mate last year. So, what is that like as the backdrop to these killings over the weekend?
Yeah, I mean it's been traumatic. Um and of course we've all experienced the pandemic and then the pandemic I think just completely rewired a lot of people's brains. Um so I will say that there's such a strong communitarian streak here.
Mm,
It goes back to the Scandinavians who settled the place, and there's such strong social and familial networks
yes.
that I think it's put us in better stead than if we'd been in other places. I've lived in Nevada
Mm,
where it's very atomized. People don't know their neighbors.
right,
They very often have moved. They've almost always moved from somewhere else. Um, so that they often don't have family and tight social networks. Um, and so I think that make gives us a lot of resiliency.
mhm.
Um, I'm not from here, so Minnesotans can annoy me, but but I do feel lucky that and I feel like I'm needing to continue a legacy of those strong communitarian values.
Mhm,
Um, I don't want to paper over the fact that the just as everywhere else, partisan polarization has gotten
right,
terrible. But I think it's encouraging that a lot of Republicans, including very right wing Republicans, were pushing back on some of the disinformation this weekend.
good.
Um, and they were saying, like, you don't really, it's because it's embarrassing to them,
Yeah,
to be a Republican and be associated with this cockamamie idea that that Tim Walz somehow was involved in the assassination of a friend of his.
right.
Um, so I think Republicans were embarrassed by it, pushed back on it. I have not heard them. I would like to hear from Tom Emmer, Majority Whip, the Minnesota congressman, and Pete Stauber.
Mhm,
It's clear they loathe Walls, but
mhm.
they need to talk about Mike Lee
Yeah,
and what he did yesterday. Um, but that's not the Republican Party anymore,
right.
I'm afraid.
I did see there was a joint statement, across party lines from Minnesota lawmakers, including Tom Emmer and, Tina Smith, who I understand was on the target list. But, while it was wonderful to see the condemnation of violence, of course, that alliance didn't go beyond to, condemning people like Mike Lee and the disinformation because that is a lifeblood that flows through the far right of the Republican Party now, which is such a challenge. And, I was listening to you talk about kind of this communitarian spirit, and just on a personal note, my grandfather's family came over from Sweden to Minneapolis, and I was able to go to the Swedish Heritage Center and actually track all of that down, and, like, that's a point of pride, and so, you can see that spirit. There is still that spirit of Minnesota nice, Midwest nice, but, this hyperpartisanship really does test that, and so it's a huge challenge for us all. Um, I did wanna talk to you a little bit about the No Kings protest. I know that, like in so many cities, there was one scheduled in Minneapolis, and police were encouraging people not to go because there was a manhunt going on, but thousands of people did show up to the state capitol, and I know that, the Minnesota Reformer covered that. What was the mood there? Why did people feel the need to show up anyway, even with this devastating violence that had just taken place?
Yeah, I mean, I honestly, I there are a lot of people who are probably there without they got there and only learned the news,
Ah,
because things were really just trickling out mid-morning and people were already gathering for the march. Um, but there was a huge crowd. I mean, if there's one thing that Minnesota progressives do, it's come out for marches and rallies.
right.
And but there was a lot of people there. I mean,
Mhm.
this what's amazing about this protest movement, and this is true, of course, nationwide, is that a lot of first timers, they've never been to protests. A lot of veterans, who are mad about the Doge cuts, to
Mhm.
veteran services, and all the federal employees who are veterans who were fired. Um, so, but it was somber,
Yeah.
because the news spread, and but Nicole, our photographer who was on the scene, she really captured, I think, a mood that was also resolute, that we need to be resilient here, um, and do it for Melissa.
I so appreciate you joining us today, to talk about this very important story. Thank you so much, Patrick. And thank you to all of you for joining us today on Lincoln Square. And Patrick, please, keep in touch with us because I know there's always so much that's happening in your state.
Thanks so much. It was good to be here.
Thank you.